Welcome everyone to the Fermentation Association's webinar of Fermented Dairy and Health. I'm Amelia Nielsen-Stoll, editor of TFA. We are a trade group that was launched to support producers who use fermentation to create delicious and often healthful food and beverages. Our goals are to help educate consumers about fermentation and its benefits, support scientific research into those health benefits, and work with food safety authorities to establish clearer and more appropriate regulations in regards to fermentation. Today, we bring you two great speakers, Dr. Chris Cifelli, Vice President of Nutrition Research for the National Dairy Council, and Dr. Maria Marco, Professor of Food Science and Technology at University of California, Davis. We have many questions already submitted and reviewed with our speakers. If there are additional topics you'd like to see addressed, please enter them in the chat below and we will try to get to them. I will come back at the end to ask questions. For now, I will turn it over to Maria and Chris.
Thank you, Amelia. Well, welcome everyone. It's really my pleasure to be here with you today to moderate this exciting seminar that's going to be given by Dr. Chris Cifelli. So a little bit about Dr. Cifelli. He is the Vice President of Nutrition Research at the U.S. National Dairy Council, or NDC. In this position, Dr. Cifelli leads the Dairy and Public Health Research Platform, the goal of which is to provide scientific evidence on the role of dairy foods in health and sustainable eating patterns. Dr. Cifelli is responsible for the strategic planning, development, management, and communication of research on the effects of dairy consumption on type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, bone health, and childhood nutrition. In addition, Dr. Cifelli leads NDC research utilizing the NHANES dataset. Dr. Cifelli obtained both his bachelor's degree in biology and PhD degree in nutritional sciences from the Pennsylvania State University, where his graduate work focused on understanding how vitamin A status and inflammation affected retinoic acid metabolism. Additionally, he utilized mathematical modeling to study the effects of retinoic acid supplementation on whole body vitamin A kinetics. During his postdoctoral work at Penn State, he examined vitamin A kinetics, storage, and disposal rates in adults with different ethnic backgrounds. Dr. Cifelli is active in several professional organizations. He currently serves as the chair of the Nutrition Translation Research Interest Section in the American Society for Nutrition. He is the chair of the Science and Translation Committee for the International Scientific Association for Probiotics and Prebiotics. Dr. Cifelli is also chair of the Gut Microbiome Committee of the International Life Science Institute, or ILSI, in North America, and is on the board of directors for the Yogurt in Nutrition Initiative, a global collaborative project led by the Danone Institute International. In addition, Dr. Cifelli has authored or co-authored over 35 peer-reviewed manuscripts, reviews, and abstracts. So welcome.
Thanks, Maria. And thank you everyone for being here today to talk about fermented dairy and health. It's a topic I'm extremely passionate about and excited to talk with all of you about today. And, you know, hindsight's always 20/20, and I can't even tell you the number of times I would walk back past the creamery at Penn State and duck in for, you know, ice cream or cheese or a snack that, you know, to kind of get me through my classes there. And, you know, it's kind of funny that my career would take me from, you know, an undergrad in biology to now working for America's dairy farmers and the National Dairy Council. So I guess maybe it was a sign that my love for dairy even back then would lead me to where I am today. So for today's talk, I would like to, you know, start with some sales and information on consumption data on fermented dairy, you know, which for me is going to focus mostly on yogurt and cheese data, because that's what my organization has access to. Then we'll transition into the health benefits associated with fermented dairy foods and talk a little bit about chronic disease risk. And then a topic that's, you know, kind of hot with consumers, this idea of inflammation, especially how it ties into gut health, because those two go hand in hand. And then, you know, it'll be have some time for questions and answers for anything that may come up during this presentation today. So most of you probably know this, it's more common to you than when I typically give these presentations, but, fermented foods have been around for thousands of years, and what has been a tried and true way to preserve food and make it more nutritious, has gained renewed interest in the last, 10 or 15 years among consumers as they have looked to things like kombuchas and kimchi and yogurts and kefir and other fermented foods for wellness benefits. And again, most of you are aware what is a fermented food and how fermented foods are prepared. So I won't spend too much time just to remind you that, fermented foods, whether you're talking kimchi or sauerkraut or pickles, are made during bacterial or other microbe growth that transforms the starting food into a different matrix. So in terms of yogurt, right, you start with your milk and then you turn it into yogurt or milk into cheese as an example. And the value, as you can see at the bottom, it's a source of live microbes. It improves the taste and texture and digestibility. It can increase the levels of different vitamins and bioactive compounds. And it can also remove toxic or anti-nutrients. And again, going back to why our ancestors really use this is, it increased food safety and shelf life. Now, fermented foods are as I said, a hot topic. I pulled some snippets off the internet. You can see even this year, 2021, of the top 10 superfoods, fermented foods are at the top of that list. And they were the same in 2019 as well. But you can see all these different articles that are looking at pickling and fermenting, and consumers are really interested in this for the potential gut benefits that they are providing. And that is translated into increased sales. So I'll show a couple slides on this, and using yogurt as an example, you can see that going back now to 1995 when I first had the data for up until about 2015. So for about 20 years there was a pretty steady increased growth that started to decline some in recent years as consumer preferences, how they want the food, more travel, more convenience, were impacting the sales of yogurt. But we did see that while yogurt retail sales were going down, this data through the middle of August last year was showing year-end growth up about 2%. And actually, the most recent data I have, which I just actually got this morning, so I had to write it down. So I apologize for looking. Year end on 2020, yogurt volume rose at about 4%. In December alone, it was up 6%. And through last week, or the last week of January, it's continued its strong growth with upward 2%. We've also seen that cheese has shown steady growth, and that the fermented dairy foods in particular have shown strong growth, especially as COVID has kind of hit and transformed where we're eating and how we're eating, with more cooking at home, more retail shopping to complement what we normally would buy in restaurants. Now, importantly, beyond just tasting great and being, my wife adds yogurt to our muffins and stuff like that, yogurt consumption has been shown to be linked with better diet quality. So those who consume yogurt tend to have higher intakes of not only the nutrients you would associate with milk and dairy foods like vitamin D and calcium and magnesium, but also fiber and riboflavin, and the higher intakes of better diet quality overall. And this was seen both here in the US using the NHANES data, and in Britain using the NDNS data set. So yogurt consumers aren't just eating more yogurt, they tend to also eat healthier in general, which is, as a nutritionist, a really good thing, and what you would like to see. You'd like to see people improve their diet quality by making small changes, and dairy foods can allow that. Now, I'll spend the bulk of the rest of the time on different health outcomes. And obviously I can't, as much as I would like to, cover every study that's been done on fermented dairy foods and health outcomes. I can highlight some systematic reviews and meta-analyses to kind of pool all the data together to kind of give you an idea of how the evidence is all pointing in one direction in terms of how fermented dairy improves health. And again, when I use the word dairy, I am really talking about cow's milk dairy foods. And, we'll touch on kefir a little bit in the end for this presentation. So on this slide, you can see starting at the highest level when you look at total dairy. So this would include milk, cheese, yogurt together. There's consistent evidence that total dairy foods are associated with a lower risk of type 2 diabetes. You can see both of these meta-analyses, which are pooling 17 studies in the AGCN paper and 16 in the PLOS one, close to 1 million participants when you look at them together. And in each, regardless of the actual serving, whether it's 400 grams or slightly less, you can see there's a significant reduction in type 2 diabetes risk. When you drill down then to just yogurt in particular, the association gets even more robust. You can see you're looking at reductions of risk by drinking or eating yogurt of about 14 to 17%. And again, the numbers aren't as important as the directionality and the magnitude. On the other slide, you saw that both those two large meta-analyses for total dairy both trending in the same direction, despite including slightly different studies depending on their inclusion-exclusion criteria. And here the same thing is true. You have one looking at the nurses' health studies and the health professional studies, and the other looking at a variety, 22 different cohorts. And again, you're seeing the same reduction of risk with yogurt consumption. And again, when some of these studies were conducted, you're lumping all yogurts together. So we're not teasing apart Greeks. We're not teasing apart those with added sugar versus plain yogurts, low fat or full fat. This is all yogurts together. That yogurt consumption in general is showing this reduction of risk when it comes to diabetes. And just building on that, a lot of questions usually get asked of me about the fat level and are fuller fat varieties better or the lower fat varieties, and really there's no evidence that the fuller fat varieties are worse for you. Indeed, a lot of studies show that they're equally beneficial, and that just consumption of yogurt in general tends to have be related to beneficial impacts on health. And this study on the screen from Darius Mozafarian's group out of Tufts shows this, where these different fatty acids, these unique odd chain fatty acids, which only ruminant animals can make for the most part, are associated with lower risk of type 2 diabetes again. So higher fat dairy consumption had that same association with lower risk of type 2 diabetes than the lower fat varieties is the point of this. And the mechanism is not known. It's probably the live cultures. It could be improving, lowering inflammation or improving gut health. It could be, again, overall diet quality. But regardless, the evidence, because we can't show cause and effect with cohort studies, is pointing in the direction of lower risk of type 2 diabetes, which is really important given that in the US alone, diabetes is affecting upwards of close to 30 million people. And if you include those who are pre-diabetic, you're up to about 100 million people in the US, which is about 1/3 of our population. So this is a significant health outcome that can be, we could lower the risk of that by simply, having people consume more yogurt. Now, pivoting a little to weight gain, we're into the new year. A lot of us maybe have made some New Year's resolutions, and maybe by now I know I've not stuck to mine as well as I've intended, but one that's always on consumers' mind, and why fermented foods tend to always be near the top, is weight and weight maintenance. And while this study now is going on 10 years old, it's still really important as it points out that cheese and yogurt, two fermented foods, are associated with either no weight gain or less weight gain over time, and again a large cohort of nearly 300,000 people. And again, this is regardless of fat content and other things as they kind of control for different variables. So much like the diabetes, the evidence is showing that eating fermented dairy foods is not going to increase your risk of gaining weight over time or increase your odds of becoming obese. Now what about cheese? Which most varieties of cheese, or a good portion of varieties of cheeses are fermented as well. We know that cheese has a lot of sodium and fat in it naturally, but does that, do you not see that same benefits? A lot of people perceive the fermented health halo over yogurt, but don't always think of cheese the same way. But the reality is that cheese also behaves differently than you would perceive from the nutrients in there. You would think just by looking at the nutrient facts panel that, wow, it's got a lot of saturated fat. If I eat, this portion of cheese or a couple portions of cheese, it's really going to increase my risk of cardiovascular disease. And really, whether you look at CVD as an endpoint in cohort studies or in clinical trials such as this one, you're not really seeing that same effect that you would hypothesize just by the amount of saturated fat in the cheese. So in this clinical trial, they compared a regular cheddar cheese to a reduced cheddar cheese to a control group, which was carbohydrate control in this study. And you can see, I pulled out the main finding that consuming the regular cheese for 12 weeks did not alter LDL cholesterol levels or any other of the risk factors for metabolic syndrome, or glucose tolerance, weight gain, or any of that. So again, just whether it's the fermentation process, whether it's a matrix effect, regardless, eating cheese doesn't have a negative impact on blood lipids as you would naturally think. If we take cheese then from that small clinical trial, that 12-week trial, and look at disease reduction, you can see for CVD, coronary heart disease, and stroke, in this meta-analysis, cheese consumption was associated with a lower risk across the board. And you can see that this was, at about, little over 1.3 ounces of cheese, which in the US is a little over a serving of cheese. Now, another risk factor for cardiovascular disease is high blood pressure, hypertension. You can see, again, using the Nurses' Health data, which is a large, powerful cohort run out of Harvard. You can see yogurt intake being associated both alone and in conjunction with overall healthy eating pattern as being associated with a lower risk of high blood pressure. So not surprising, given what I showed earlier about type 2 diabetes, and a lot of these metabolic abnormalities are linked together. But whether consuming yogurt or eating it in combination, you see close to a 30% reduction in high blood pressure when you combine yogurt with other healthy foods. In that same cohort, if you looked at those who at baseline had high blood pressure, and then you looked at, well, would they develop cardiovascular disease later? And how would that compare with those who ate yogurt versus those who didn't eat yogurt? And again, those who consumed yogurt had lower risk of developing cardiovascular disease. So the yogurt consumption, whether you didn't have any metabolic abnormalities at baseline, or whether you were already predisposed a little bit because you had high blood pressure for CVD risk down the line, either way, those who consumed yogurt had a lower risk of a negative endpoint at the end. So it's a little bit, like I said, I can't get into all the evidence on yogurt and cheese, but a little bit on both of those. Now, what about kefir and health? Because you're seeing more and more, or at least I am in those grocery stores that I shop in, more and more kefirs pop up, and I've heard some really interesting talks in the last year on kefir. Kefir is produced through the fermentation of milk with special kefir grains. Like yogurt, or different varieties of yogurt, it originated in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, and it's been consumed for hundreds of years. So again, this is, I think, one of the cool things about fermented foods, and why I love talking about them, is they're natural. They've been around for a long time. We know they're safe because people for generations and hundreds of thousands of years have either been drinking them or eating them without adverse health effects. You can see the global market for kefir is growing, and projections have it to be just south of $2 billion by in the next 5 or 6 years. So it is a booming market. Because kefir intake in general in the U.S. is pretty low, you can't really look at it in Hanes per se, like you can with milk, cheese, or yogurt. But I found a couple of really good reviews that I've read in the past, and I liked one of the figures from them, which I'm sharing with you today. And you can see some of the potential health benefits that have been linked with kefir, including some of the things we'll talk about or have talked about with yogurt, lower inflammation, better cholesterol levels, improved gut health, reduced hypertension. So while you can't say that just because you see this in yogurt, you would see it in cheese, you would see it in kefir, there still seems to be some potential underlying mechanisms that may be similar across these 3 dairy foods. And again, maybe it's the live cultures in there that are playing a role in helping to modulate the immune system or help maintain our gut microbiota diversity. Maybe it's the bioactive compounds that are produced during the fermentation of the nutrients that are found in milk. But either way, I don't think it's coincidental that you see similar potential health benefits across these different foods. As I said, one topic and that comes up a lot are dairy foods and inflammation. And there's lots of diets online. If you just Google like inflammation and anti-inflammatory diets, you get run the gamut of diets that tell you to cut out nightshades and tomatoes and others that tell you to eliminate dairy. And as somebody who's got Italian parents, right? If you tell me to cut out like tomatoes and cheese, it's pretty much to say I wouldn't be a very happy camper. But I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about the inflammatory process and chronic inflammation. We know that in animal studies clearly, and even that chronic inflammation does increase cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, glucose regulation, and the like. In human trials, obviously there's a lot of evidence to show that those who have diabetes and CVD and hypertension have higher circulating levels of different cytokines and pro-inflammatory molecules, and gut leakiness as measured by using different sugars or different mechanisms shows that there seems to be higher LPS and other things in the bloodstream. But but what does that mean for when we're eating foods? Should we be cutting out certain foods? In particular, dairy. Is dairy inflammatory? Most of us understand inflammation, right? Especially the acute side of the figure I'm showing. We've all experienced the pain and redness and the swelling that come with scraping a knee or cutting a finger, or and that is important, right? That is an immune response to help heal and clean and ensure that there's not any infections. On the other side is this idea of this chronic inflammation, which is more low grade, right? We can't feel this type of inflammation. My mom asks a lot of questions about nutrition, and it's part of the reason I got into nutrition, because she asked these type of questions when I was an undergrad, and I decided, well, maybe I'll take a class in it, and I fell in love with nutrition. But she'll ask a lot of these questions, and the way my mom talks, you'd think like she's walking around needing a fire extinguisher to put out the fire in her gut because it's inflamed, and and you hear people talk, oh my God, I'm just so inflamed, and we can't feel that. We don't know what's going on, but there is this potential for gut leakiness and dysregulation of the immune system, which could be causing longer-term upregulation of pro-inflammatory molecules that could contribute to the development of or could exacerbate the existing conditions you see there. So we think chronic inflammation is linked to things like neurological diseases and rheumatoid arthritis, is obviously an autoimmune disease, cancers, obesity. But our understanding of this is still evolving. But nevertheless, this is an important scientific topic. It's also a topic that's really important for consumers as they, again, look for foods and beverages that may improve their overall wellness. So when it comes specifically to fermented dairy, there was a clinical trial done published a couple years ago, 2 separate papers that looked at feeding 1.5 servings of low-fat yogurt per day for 9 weeks. And this was a parallel group design in normal weight and obese people. So there was a lot of subjects in this, I think 120 in total. The control group received a soy pudding, and admittedly that soy pudding was not fermented. So it was what was available to the PI at the time, but just noting that we are comparing a fermented food to a non-fermented food. And you can see that consumption of the 1.5 servings of low-fat yogurt per day reduced several biomarkers of chronic inflammation and also improved gut integrity compared to the control in the study. No other aspects of their diet were changed. They asked them to maintain their normal activity level, maintain their normal alcohol consumption and the like. In that same study, they did a nested postprandial feeding. So they gave them a high-fat, high-calorie meal and looked right after the meal at inflammation, because we know that post-meal period is really important to how the immune system responds. And the same thing they saw there, that consuming a yogurt right before that meal helped maintain blood glucose after the meal and lowered inflammation. This was just a normal yogurt. They say it in the paper, so it's just I think a Yoplait. So it was sugar. Had added sugar in it. It was not a special Greek yogurt or anything like that. It was not a yogurt with added probiotics. It was just a pretty standard yogurt. So again, you could hypothesize maybe a Greek yogurt or a kefir or a lower sugar yogurt maybe these benefits would be even more pronounced. But nonetheless, just adding a cup of yogurt per day helped lower some of these biomarkers for chronic inflammation. Just published, like a week or 2 ago was this paper looking at the Framingham offspring cohort. So again, an observational evidence. And it more or less showed the same that the clinical trial that I just presented showed, that yogurt consumption was associated with lower levels of 2 inflammatory biomarkers, IL-6 and fibrin. And those are 2 very potent cytokines that promote inflammation. You'll see that in this cohort, milk and cheese was not related to inflammation, didn't increase it, didn't decrease it, but the yogurt, again, lowered. So, over all these studies, whether diabetes or hypertension, inflammation, weight gain, yogurt is pretty consistently shown to have a beneficial effect, both in clinical trials and observational. Cheese, very similar as well. Especially when it comes to the lipids. And cheese maybe not as pronounced. It tends to be a little bit more neutral sometimes on some of these impacts, but it's not increasing your risk, which I think a lot of people misconstrue. And finally, just to put it all together with inflammation, you can see there's been 3 different systematic reviews on this. Again, it's a really, really hot topic. And you can see that across each of those systematic reviews, the dairy was not associated with increased inflammation. And in a lot of instances, especially if people were obese or had some underlying metabolic conditions, it was associated with a lower inflammation. So, you should feel good if you enjoy consuming dairy foods, that it's not gonna make your gut burst into flames. The funny thing is I show all my mom this and she still doesn't believe me and listens to my aunt who tells her to, grind up like grass clippings and, that'll help. So not really sure what my nutrition degree does when it comes to my mom, but hopefully you'll believe me more than her when it comes to, eating your yogurt and cheese and kefir. My last slide, I was trying to think of a way to kind of tie it all together. And, I think we're learning in nutrition over, when nutrition science started, right, we were trying to understand things like beriberi and night blindness and rickets and what was causing pellagra and diseases like that, even going back to scurvy. So the beginning of nutrition science was a lot of biochemistry and chemistry to isolate these compounds, the vitamins and minerals that were causing deficiencies, figure out the amounts that would prevent those deficiencies and improve overall health. And once we kind of figured that out and got to fortify different foods and help people understand, nutrition has then translated to, well, these same nutrients maybe have impacts on more chronic disease risk. And so things they looked at, beta carotene and lung cancer, which didn't work out, and we've tried to explain things through LDL cholesterol with saturated fat. And I think what we're learning is that the matrix of the food is so important. Like, food is so complex. It is not just these nutrients. It's kind of like Maria will appreciate it because I borrow this analogy from Bruce German at UC Davis. It's like a car. Like, you can take a car apart and you can say that's a tire and that's the engine and here's the transmission, but a car works when everything is together. And that's kind of like a food. A food works when everything is together. And why maybe these effects that we see with fermented dairy are so important is because of that unique dairy matrix. We know about the nutrients, we know the protein in there, but the fat, as you can see on the side, there's 400 different fatty acids just in full fat milk and in fuller fat dairy products. There's bioactives that we're still trying to elucidate and understand what they do. And that doesn't even take into account then when you add the starter cultures and you ferment the milk into either like yogurt or a certain cheese, or what happens when you make it a blue cheese and you add another microbe into the mix that kind of transforms it. And this is, again, this would hold true. I could change the title to sauerkraut's matrix, or pickles, or kimchi, or name soy yogurt matrix. I think that matrix of the food is so important. So why we see these, I think people we try in nutrition science to explain it down to, well, it's got these nutrients, that nutrient, but it is such a unique package. And to keep that in mind that, we do want to recommend foods. And, I think when we think back through history again, fermented foods have been around for 10,000 years. They've helped humans kind of get to where we are now, whether you're talking beer and wine or lower versions of that were cleaner than the drinking water, to things like yogurt and cheese that provided nutrients and calories that they couldn't get otherwise. So I think this is a great summary because, I can't explain the mechanisms why yogurt is this, but it is this unique matrix that, hopefully as we kind of continue to evolve with and our understanding of fermentation, we can get to the point where this makes a little bit more sense and we can kind of pinpoint, but the sum is definitely more than all of its parts. So with that, I really appreciate your attention, and taking time. I think I saw somebody in the chat say they were from Turkey, which is awesome. So it's nighttime there, I'm imagining. So I appreciate you taking time in your evening to listen to me. And those in the West Coast, it's still the morning. I've got the conclusions in there, and I'd be happy to kind of discuss anything that came up during the presentation. Thank you.
Chris?
Hey, Maria.
Wonderful talk. Thank you. I learned so much. And I'm someone who loves cheese and yogurt. So just great to hear the good news about the findings from these perspective and crossover studies. Kind of makes me enjoy my cheese even more.
That's right. Guilt-free, guilt-free.
Yeah. Personal preferences aside, as you know, I've been looking at the nutrition and clinical literature on fermented foods. And what's really impressed me is really the number of studies, mainly prospective observational studies, but some randomized controlled trials on fermented dairy, to the extent that it is really the only food or food group that has substantial evidence for health benefits. So just thinking about how did we get here kind of question. What do you think stimulated or has made possible the examination of fermented dairy for health? overall benefit risks?
That's a really, really good question. I've actually never had it asked like that. So a couple things I think pop right into mind. I think one is for dairy in particular, going back to nutrition science, like Ansel Keys in the 50s, who hypothesized that saturated fat was the reason for heart disease. And obviously, when you look at the data, cheese and dairy foods, whole milk, were then and now one of the major contributors of saturated fat. So I think a lot of work on cheese started with that, started in the late 50s, early 60s, and then evolved as we kind of started thinking about, as I said in the end, the parts weren't the same, that, maybe it's this fermentation. For yogurt, I think it really, and you probably know this too, the bulk of the literature has really been the last 20 years, 25 years is where, and I think a couple of things, the emergence of systematic reviews and meta-analyses have allowed for us to better look at things like yogurt, because yogurt's not highly consumed, based on Hanes data here in the US, the average person isn't consuming a whole lot, but when you can pool a lot of different studies, you can increase your power. And that's allowed us to kind of start looking at these associations. And that's really the limitation with some of these other fermented foods, is there's just not enough intake yet, and we need more cohort studies to kind of look, ask the question, right? A food frequency questionnaire typically doesn't ask you eat kimchi or, are you drinking kombucha, and until those questionnaires start asking those questions, we as scientists then don't have the data to say, hey, is kombucha or kimchi or name your fermented food associated with better health? So dairy has also benefited that, going back to the earliest food frequency questionnaires, they've asked, do you drink milk? Do you eat cheese? Do you eat yogurt? And that's definitely a gap that people need to fill. We need to ask what people are, or better characterize what people are eating, so we can begin to understand how other fermented foods potentially impact health.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's I agree 100%. And just having looked a little bit at NHANES and what kind of foods are listed there, pickles are, there's pickled fruits and vegetables, not the word fermented doesn't even come in.
No, not at all. No.
So there's a lot needed to increase the use of these, naming of these foods in questionnaires. You showed a lot of evidence here that fermented dairy can be beneficial, as opposed to maybe where it started as maybe thinking the negative aspects of intake, but it's quite the opposite. What do you see presently as barriers to recognition of fermented dairy as being healthy foods, if there are any?
Yeah, no, there's definitely barriers. I mean, there's certainly barriers. I think the two biggest barriers there's a few, but I'll try to pick a couple. I think there's the perception that dairy foods, all dairy foods come with gut discomfort, lactose intolerance being the primary driver. People are typically surprised when I tell them that, hey, you can eat yogurt because the live active cultures in there help with lactose digestion. And same with cheese. A lot of hard cheeses have lower lactose. So I think there's a perception of gut health. Other concerns, consumers are certainly now more are worried about other issues. So recently we've heard, things about hormones, it always comes up in milk, but, all foods have hormones again. And there's really no evidence that dairy foods are contributing to that. But I think the general discomfort, the things like, hormones, is it going to cause acne, those types of things. And when you Google it, we all go to Dr. Google for our answers a lot of times. Those are the things that pop up. And if the right evidence isn't there and in a understandable fashion, it could turn people off to those products.
Yeah. Maybe a couple other questions, and we'll turn it over to Amelia. But I'm eager to hear if you see any, or you've seen any emerging areas in dairy that this kind of relates to health claims, or claims, structure function claims you can be making. and maybe specifically on, the current public interest in our microbiome. Is there any activity in dairy that's emerging or kind of speaks to that?
Yeah, no, the convergence of the gut microbiome with precision nutrition, I think over the next 10 years is really going to transform messaging and claims. And we are trying to understand how fermented dairy foods in particular are really impacting gut microbiota diversity. I think, and you can appreciate this, Maria, and others on the call, like we don't really know yet what a healthy microbiome is. Like my microbiome's health is different than yours, different than others on the call. And I think the biggest barrier is that is a broad definition of what a healthy microbiome is. So for like a structure function claim, like for bone health, right, you could say calcium and vitamin D because we've established what is the criteria for healthy bone and that those vitamins and minerals impact it. Like once we get that criteria for what is a healthy microbiome, then all these fermented foods, including dairy, we can begin to understand, well, yeah, look, we're contributing to the maintenance of that. I think we're getting, I mean, just in what, the last 15 years or so, I mean, the ability of our ability to get data on the microbiome is, you know better than anybody, exploded, right? So I think we'll get there, but that's pretty much the biggest barrier. What we're trying to help work towards is what is that definition, and then how can dairy foods fit into that? I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, that was great. It's a pretty open-ended question. That's spot on. Addressing what I was answering what I was asking. One question I had, you talked about the matrix effects, and looking at the yogurt, the cup of yogurt as a whole rather than the individual nutrients. There is a lot of interest in plant-based yogurts and cheese. How translatable do you think what we know about bovine milk, fermented dairy, is that translatable at all?
Yeah, I honestly don't know. Like if yogurt, dairy, cow's yogurt to soy or an almond, I would imagine, or if you ask me to hypothesize, I would say they probably have similar effects maybe on the gut. They are using starter cultures that are helping to transform that starting material, whether almond milk or soy milk. I don't know the exact processing procedure, but those starting cultures obviously are presumably alive through shelf life, and you're getting that same live culture consumption that could impact health. So definitely I would, if I was developing a hypothesis, think that they have maybe not the same effects because they don't have the same nutrients and the same bioactives because they don't have the same starting material. But I would imagine much like, you would see some health benefits associated with that, especially related to gut and inflammation. But those are, I did do a quick search yesterday when I was preparing for this, putting in different terms like, soy and yogurt and almond and yogurt. And there's just not a lot of evidence out there yet. And it's definitely a gap that I think warrants further investigation.
So this actually leads to my last question for you, because I know there are people on the call and interested in other fermented foods, plant, any other, where we have maybe one or two our randomized control trials available as evidence. So, as we want to continue with understanding the health benefits of fermented foods, do you have any advice for those people producing or studying different types of fermented foods? What would be a pathway forward for investigating how these foods can benefit our health?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think obviously don't want to develop a whole research program for people, right? But I think the small clinical trials, powered appropriately, you could do a crossover design type study would help. I do think the biggest barrier though is just finding out what people are eating and then doing these correlations. As you said, the bulk of the evidence for dairy is all observational, which can't do cause and effect, but if you see it in enough times and enough populations across the globe, it gives us some pretty good confidence that there's a health benefit. And then people have been eating fermented fish and vegetables and other foods for thousands of years. So your intuition tells you they're inherently healthy. So it is just now figuring out how can I test that and I would say the gut is probably the best outcome for that, whether it be barrier function or inflammatory markers or stool consistency or microbiota, because I think that's where the majority of those impacts are going to be. But yeah, there's certainly opportunities out there for those foods. But we wouldn't have been eating them all these years if they weren't healthy for us.
Thanks, Chris.
Even beer, right? Even beer and wine.
All right, Amelia, are there any questions? Keep the conversation going.
Hi, yes. Thank you so much, Chris. This has been fascinating. We had a question from Bob Hutkins. Hi, Dr. Hutkins. He asked, as much yogurt as we consume now in the US, we're still way behind many European and Middle Eastern countries. Any hypothesis why that's the case?
Yeah, it's a good question, Bob. I don't know, and this is hard because this is where my personal bias comes in, because we're a yogurt eating family. Whether it's Greek, Giovanni, the flips, that are like desserts that are delicious. I think one is convenience. It's yogurt, not the drinkable kinds of yogurt. You need a spoon, you need to sit down. Some of it seems to be convenience. I think others, it's just wasn't a traditional food that Americans typically just ate. And I think the trends are showing it's ticking up, but you're right, it's still way low in terms of what, it makes up such a small percentage of dairy and then that. But I think it's just cultural. It's not something that people traditionally think to go and eat and buy and stuff. Do see more of it now. COVID definitely changed it. People being home, whether they were using it for cooking or to make sauces or just to have a treat around for them or the kids. I think we're trying to unlock what's the barrier for people to kind of pick yogurt up off the shelf.
Yeah. Well, that leads perfectly into the other question we got. Someone asked, do you think there is correlation for the uptake in yogurt consumption in 2020 with COVID? And then they mentioned there have been studies involving the gut microbiome with less serious COVID cases.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yogurt intake was up because of COVID. They were seeing increases in the squeezable tubes for kids, and more importantly, the big tubes, big tubs of yogurt, so not the single serves. Those were actually what was driving a lot of the sales. So people were buying more of the big tubs to, again, cook with or make with. And I think part of it is COVID for sure. Part of it was, we weren't going out and exercising. So that halo of yogurt being healthy, but it was definitely driven by COVID and reversed that downward trend we were seeing.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Am I frozen?
Yeah, we can hear you, but you're.
Well, all right. I'm glad it didn't end on an awkward facial expression here, but I have a few more questions for you.
Please, yeah.
So why is real milk kefir made with kefir grains very hard to find on the shelves today and produce at a commercial level?
That's a good question. Obviously, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to know for sure, as it probably comes down to just the ease of producing it and mass producing it and shipping. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what the barrier is to making the real milk, like the traditional kefir, I guess, compared to what some of the other marketable ones are.
So we had a question, what are the limitations for making more correlation claims about the benefit of fermented dairy products?
I guess they mean like, being able to put like a claim on pack maybe, or say, on the label that yogurt reduces risk for diabetes.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, that's just labeling law. And then you get into the realm of, health claims and qualified health claims. And to get those type of messaging on pack or even on your website, because I think they consider your website the same as on pack, you need more strong clinical trial evidence, and then they'll run it up through the FTC and FDA. Now, as Maria pointed out, structure function claims are much more doable. You could put on pack now that, calcium and vitamin D are associated with better bone health or reduce your risk for osteoporosis, and milk is a good source of those. So that's probably the best opportunity for yogurt down the line is some of these structure function claims with the gut health. But yeah, you could put about the nutrients right now in the structure, but we just don't have the clinical evidence to support more robust. Hey, this is like you see with Cheerios, right? Lowers your cholesterol. We need more clinical trials to really tease that apart.
We had a question. I guess this is more for both of you. I know there's not a ton of evidence right now, and our gut microbiome is so mysterious. Do you have any other research or anything you two have seen about the gut microbiome leading to less severe COVID cases?
I've read some stuff about it. I've also read, seen a lot of papers on things like vitamin D. I think what we've learned from COVID is that, people who are just unfortunately at risk, whether obese or micronutrient deficient, are probably the same for the microbiome. If it was already dysbiosed a little, it may have, increased the risk of having more severe COVID case. I think time will tell, obviously, as we're able to kind of go back and look, but I think there's a lot of health disparities that were pointed out by this disease, and a lot of opportunities and need to kind of improve overall nutrition across the board to help prevent this from happening again.
Yeah. Tell me how you feel about oh, sorry, Maria, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I just want to echo that to say these are complex questions, and we're not going to get the answer for COVID in the microbiome. We don't have answer for diabetes or IBD and many other chronic and even acute conditions. So it takes a number of additional steps to actually find causation between microbiome and disease risk. So we're not going to have an answer overnight on this question for COVID.
Yeah. Okay, so Chris, tell me your thoughts on raw milk cheese production and the philosophies of using those native cultures in the production of dairy products.
Yeah, I mean, raw milk cheeses are generally safe, because they're, especially the ones that have a longer shelf life. We, National Dairy Council, follow the guidance of the FDA in terms of consumption of raw milk and don't encourage the consumption of raw milk. But the making of, I think, cheeses and stuff like that, which tend to, like it said on the slide from the ISAP infographic, reduce harmful pathogens and other harmful compounds, tend to make those products safe. I mean, I've eaten raw milk cheese. Most of them have probably eaten some form of raw milk cheeses.
We had a question, Ken, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get, I hope I'm asking your right question in here, Ken. Do you think there is a social conditioning against sour tasting milk?
Oh yeah, I think there's a social conditioning against anything that's not sweet and salty in the U.S. It is. I mean, bitter, sour foods are just not something that I think we traditionally eat. So I think maybe that's a great point. I didn't even think of that back to Bob's question about why yogurt consumption is low, and it does, especially if you're not eating a sweetened yogurt or drinking a sour. If you're drinking a sour milk, right? That may turn off you and your kids or your family members to drinking and eating it. So that's a great point. Yeah, I definitely think it's something we can work on. Does that look like when you give your kids like Brussels sprouts?
Yes. And hopefully it seems to be changing in the US as fermented foods and drinks become more popular. People they like that flavor more.
They definitely do. Yeah. I mean, it's trending in that direction. So, we're fingers crossed we'll get to where more and more people are eating fermented foods.
Yes. Okay, so how does fermented dairy work for lactose intolerant people?
It's great. There's very few. I just said there's very few health claims. There is a health claim actually for yogurt and lactose intolerance. The European Food Safety Authority has an approved health claim for it. So the live active cultures help you digest yogurt. So most people who have lactose intolerance can tolerate yogurt. Same with hard cheeses. Like cheddar is very low in lactose. Most people who have lactose intolerance can enjoy that as well. So it's a great alternative for people who can't tolerate milk but still want dairy to go to the fermented versions.
Yeah, I can confirm, as someone with lactose intolerance, I can have all the fermented dairy I want. All right, so what should consumers look for when they're wanting to buy, you talked a lot about yogurt and cheeses, when they're wanting to get like a yogurt and cheese with those beneficial microorganisms, what should they look for at the store?
Yeah, first, I think you should always choose the products you're going to enjoy and eat. So choose the yogurt and cheeses that you like. For the yogurts in particular, you want to make sure that it has the live and active cultures and hasn't been pasteurized. So you want those microbes alive through the whole time. Not that we have a lot of evidence there, but studies have shown that deactivating the microbes does confer different benefits when it comes to lactose intolerance and stuff. But most of your natural cheeses, so Swiss, Gouda, cheddars, mozzarella, maybe not mozzarella, they all have live cultures. So I think as you choose what you like. And again, the studies are showing that Greek added sugar, it doesn't matter. So, I mean, as a nutritionist, I would tell you to, try to find ones with lower sugar or, go plain and add what you like to it. But hey, I have 3 kids. I would rather them pull a flip that has some, goodies in it or eat a flavored yogurt than to be diving into like a candy bar. So, I think it's a simple nutrition advice to kind of get people to eat a little bit more healthy.
Well, excellent. Chris and Maria, thank you so much for taking the time and coming and sharing with us today. We so appreciate you sharing your thoughts and your expertise. And thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar. We will post a recording of this webinar on TFA's website in the next 24 hours. We also have a number of great webinars coming up in the next few weeks, including Are Fermented Foods Probiotics, the new definition of fermented food, and the many sides of kefir. Please go to fermentationassociation.org to check these out and register. And while you're there, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Again, thank you so much today for joining us.
Thanks.
Everybody.